"I'm not ready for anything," she said. It was a Thursday in October, and she was sitting across from me at a table for two near the window, and she said it the way you say something you've practiced, looking at me directly, with a steadiness that made clear it was neither casual nor cruel. Just honest. The kind of honest that costs something to say and costs something to receive. I told her I understood. I meant it. 4 days later, I was standing in the hallway of her parents' house in Peckham, shaking her father's hand, and he was saying, "So you're the one she's been telling us about." And I could feel Nadia standing just behind him, willing me, with absolute precision, not to look too surprised. I did not look surprised. I shook the hand. I said, "Good to meet you, sir." I walked through the door into a house that smelled like jollof rice and furniture polish, and 30 years of a particular family's particular life. There were shoes by the door, a coat rack full, the particular warmth of a house that has been consistently lived in by people who like living in it. I thought, I'm going to need the full story at some point, but not right now. Right now, the only thing that matters is the handshake and not looking like someone who wasn't expecting to be here. I had met Nadia Okonkwo in August, at a mutual friend's birthday dinner. 12 people at a restaurant that nobody could entirely afford, celebrating someone turning 30 with the specific energy of people who are not yet sure they want to be 30 themselves. She was sitting 2 seats down on the opposite side of the table, and for the first 40 minutes she was a voice I found interesting before I had properly attached a face to it. She was making an argument, warmly, with genuine precision, about why a particular film that everyone at the table loved was actually 2 completely different films that had been badly edited into one, and she was right, and I said so from 2 seats down, and she looked at me for the first time. "Finally," she said, "that was the beginning. We exchanged numbers at the end of the night, not romantically. Both of us pretending it was practical, both of us aware that the pretending was obvious. She texted first, which was the first unexpected thing about her. The text was a link to an essay that continued the argument from dinner, sent without preamble or greeting, as if the conversation had simply continued across the hours since, and I read it in my car in the parking garage and felt something I hadn't felt in a while, the specific pleasure of being near someone whose mind moves fast and simply assumes yours will move with it. We met for coffee the following week. It lasted 4 hours. That is how you know. I want to give you enough of those 4 hours that you understand. She talked about the city the way someone talks about a place they're genuinely in a relationship with. Its specific textures, what it looked like at different times of day, which neighborhoods had changed and in which direction. She had opinions about things that most people accept as given, about the way conversations were designed to avoid their own centers, about the difference between people who read to know things and people who read to become someone. She asked me a question about my work and then asked a follow-up question about the answer and then a follow-up about that, until I was 3 levels deeper than I'd expected to go and had said something true that I hadn't planned to say. She ordered a flat white and then a sparkling water and then nothing else, and didn't seem to notice the time passing because she was entirely inside the conversation, and I thought, this is someone who is completely present with things. Whatever she lets herself be present with, she is fully there. I walked her to the tube. She said, "This was good," in a way that was not particularly effusive, but was entirely sincere. She went down the stairs. I stood on the pavement for a moment, before deciding I was simply going to be honest with myself about what had just happened. Something had just happened. But here is what you need to understand about Nadia before you understand anything else. She let people in by degrees. Not coldly, she wasn't cold. She was warm in the specific way of people who have decided that their warmth is a resource and will not spend it carelessly. She gave you the conversation, the attention, the full engagement. But there was an inner door, and you didn't know it was there until you were already standing in front of it, and then she would look at you, clearly, and you'd understand. This is as far as it goes for now. Over 2 months I learned to read the geography of her. She thought better walking. She always had a route when she had a problem, and you could tell the weight of what she was working through by how far she walked before she started talking. She read everything and remembered what she'd read and used it in conversation without announcing that she was using it. You simply found yourself mid-discussion, realizing you were 3 arguments deeper than you'd expected to go. She laughed with her whole face when she laughed, and then sometimes caught herself and dialed it back, as if she'd offered more than she'd calculated to offer and needed to rebalance. I learned what she ordered when she was happy versus when she was working something through. I learned that she asked questions she already knew the answer to, not to test you, but to see how you moved through the reasoning. I learned that she went quiet for a full 3 seconds before she said anything she actually meant, and that most of what fell inside that 3-second window was more true than anything she'd planned to say going in. I also learned what she didn't do. She didn't mention anyone at home, not in the way it comes out naturally. Not, "my family says," or "we were thinking," or any of the ordinary domestic grammar that bleeds into conversation without announcement. She had simply excised it, the whole vocabulary of home. I had noticed the absence without knowing what the absence meant, and I had filed it alongside other things I was holding, without yet having enough context to understand. There had been one evening, 6 weeks in, when we were watching something on her laptop. She'd put it between us on the sofa, both leaning toward the screen, and she had let her head rest against my shoulder for about 90 seconds before she straightened up again, quietly, as if reclassifying the moment as one that wasn't available yet. I didn't say anything. I'd learned by then that the worst thing you could do with Nadia was point at the thing she was deciding about. 2 months of meetings that ran past closing time, 2 months of something that was real and that neither of us had named, and then, in October, she named it in the way she named things, directly, before ambiguity could get its footing. "I'm not ready for anything," she said, and 4 days later her parents' house. Her mother, Funke, had the warmth that Nadia had, the same quality of attention, the same sense that when she looked at you, she was actually seeing you, and had already decided you were worth seeing. She guided me to the sitting room with one hand on my elbow and brought jollof rice and fried plantain from the kitchen and set them on the coffee table with the matter-of-fact abundance of someone who feeds people as a primary form of affection. The sitting room had the Sunday afternoon quality of a home, where Sunday afternoons have always been important. Family photographs on the walls in coordinated frames, a china cabinet with things in it that weren't used but were kept because they'd been given by someone specific. A television in the corner running a muted football match that nobody was watching. Her father, Emmanuel Okonkwo, was an engineer who had built a business across 30 years by refusing to let a single thing slide past him unchecked. He had the handshake of a man like that, the kind that tells you immediately where you stand. His told me he was watching, not unkindly, just watchfully, with the specific attention of a person who needs to take the measure of things before he decides what they're worth. He asked me what I did, and how long I'd been doing it, and whether I found it meaningful, and the questions had the quality of a structural inspection. He was checking the load-bearing points. Nadia sat next to me on the sofa and was slightly too composed. Not performatively, she was never performative, but the composure had a particular texture, the texture of someone managing several threads simultaneously and holding each one at exactly the right tension. She was present with me, present with her parents, and somewhere underneath both of those, present with something I hadn't been told about yet. About 40 minutes in, I noticed the photograph. It was on the mantelpiece, in a frame slightly larger than the others, the size that announces importance. A man standing with Emmanuel at what looked like a charity dinner or a business event, both of them in dark suits, both mid-laugh, the kind of photograph that gets framed because it captures two people liking each other in a way someone wanted kept. The man was maybe 40, well-dressed with the specific effort of someone who thinks about what well-dressed communicates, and there was something in his posture, even in a candid photograph, of a person who has decided he belongs in every room he enters. Nadia's eyes went to the mantelpiece once, briefly, when I looked in that direction. Then she looked at me, then at the table, and kept the conversation exactly where it was. I filed it. I filed the photo, the direction of her glance, the precise way she redirected. I filed the fact that her composure had a specific direction, relaxed with her mother, watchful with her father, but watchful in a way that suggested she was waiting for something rather than afraid of something. And I filed the particular quality of the afternoon, not tense, but loaded. As if the Sunday had a purpose that extended past the jollof rice and the muted football, the conversation across the afternoon had the particular ease of people who have decided, provisionally, that a stranger is worth their effort. Funke asked me about my family and listened with real interest, her responses specific rather than generic. She was the kind of listener who picks up a thread you thought you'd dropped and gives it back to you when it's useful. Emmanuel asked about my work with the systematic precision of a man who had spent 30 years understanding that the difference between a project that holds and one that doesn't usually lives in a detail someone overlooked. They were both, in their different ways, the same kind of thorough. Nadia participated and watched simultaneously. She answered when she was addressed and contributed to the conversation, and once reached over and touched the back of my hand briefly, correcting something I'd said about when we'd met. It was August, not September, with the casual ease of someone who has rights over small facts about a person's life. Her mother noticed. I saw her notice. Before we left, Funke pulled Nadia to the kitchen. I stayed in the sitting room with Emmanuel, who poured 2 small glasses of something amber without asking, and handed one to me. "She doesn't bring people here," he said. Not an accusation, an observation with weight in it. "I know," I said. "Do you?" He looked at the glass. "She is very careful with who she lets matter to her. She has her reasons." He turned the glass once. "I'm glad she found someone patient enough to understand that being careful doesn't mean being cold." "I understand it," I said. "I don't fully know the reasons yet." He looked at me. Something in his face shifted. A small adjustment, approval or something adjacent to it. He refilled both glasses. On the way home, Nadia was quiet for 10 minutes. The particular silence of someone assembling sentences. "I wanted them to know you existed," she said finally. "Before," she stopped. "I just wanted them to know." "Before what?" I said. "I'll explain," she said. "I'm not ready to explain yet." There it was. Not yet. Again. 3 days later, she stopped us at a crossing on the high street, mid-walk, and said, "Are you the kind of person who stays?" "Stays how?" I said. "When it gets complicated. When you walk into something and find out there's more to it than you expected going in." She was looking at the traffic light. "When it turns out the thing you agreed to is bigger than either of you realized. Are you the kind of person who decides the more is worth it?" I thought about it. "Yes," I said. "I think so. I haven't been tested in a while. But yes." She nodded, not reassured exactly. Noting, recording. The following afternoon, I was at a coffee place on the high street, waiting for her, when a man walked in and sat down across from me at my table. Not across from me specifically. He sat across from the empty chair that Nadia was about to occupy. Then he looked at me and smiled. "You must be the one she introduced at Sunday lunch," he said. The pleasantness was entirely in the surface of the statement. "I don't think we've met," I said. "Rowan," he extended his hand. "Old family friend. Emmanuel and I go back about 6 years. I've known Nadia since she was finishing her postgraduate, watched her become very impressive." He said it with the confidence of someone who considers watching a form of ownership. I shook the hand. He had the handshake of someone who has thought about what his handshake says. "She'll be here in a few minutes," I said. "I know," he said. "I won't stay." He didn't stay. He stood, adjusted his jacket, said it was good to put a face to the name. He left 2 minutes before Nadia arrived. She walked in, saw me, saw where my eyes moved and her entire face changed. "How long?" she said. 3 minutes. He said he's an old family friend. "What else?" "That he's known you since your postgraduate, that he knew you'd be here." I looked at her. "He knew you'd be here." She sat down without taking her coat off. She looked at the table for a moment, and I could see her deciding, the same calculation I'd watched her do when she'd said I'm not ready for anything, the same weighing of what it costs to say something against what it costs to not say it. "He told you he knew you'd be here," I said quietly. "He knows my schedule." She said it flatly, as if it were weather, a condition she'd adapted to and stopped being startled by. "He makes it his business to know where I am and with whom. He frames it as concern, keeping up with an old family friend." She picked up the cup and set it down again. "He was there to see you, to make sure you saw him first, before I'd had the chance to explain who he was, so that when I explained it there would already be an image. Him shaking your hand, pleasant, relaxed, fully at home in a place that belongs to me. He wanted me off balance before I knew I needed to be on balance," I said. "Yes." She looked at me. "That is exactly what he wanted." This time the math came out differently. He wasn't a bad memory, she said. I need you to understand that first. He isn't something that happened and ended. He is a current problem. She told me in the coffee shop with her coat still on and her hands wrapped around a cup she didn't drink. She told me the way you tell something when the cost of keeping it has finally exceeded the cost of saying it. In full, in order, without softening the shape of it. 6 years ago, her father had reached a crossroads. 30 years of an engineering business, built from nothing, needing capital to expand that he didn't have and didn't want to take from a bank at terms that felt like surrender. Rowan's family ran a private investment group, old money professionally managed, the kind of wealth that knows exactly how to make itself useful to people who are building. He made Emmanuel a loan, private arrangement, favorable terms, the kind that feels like generosity when you receive it. They always feel like generosity. Rowan became a fixture from that point forward. At family dinners, at celebrations, at the edges of decisions. Gradually becoming the person Emmanuel consulted. Becoming someone Funke trusted because Emmanuel trusted him. Occupying the space in the family's life that a person can occupy when they have made themselves indispensable, before anyone thought to ask whether they wanted to be indispensable to them. And gradually, through proximity, through accumulated assumption, through the specific way families can mistake their own wishes for their child's future, he had become the person her parents had quietly decided was the right fit for Nadia. Nobody had said it out loud. That was what made it so difficult to name. There was no arrangement, no declaration, just the framed photograph, the invitations, the way Emmanuel once said, Rowan thinks when explaining a decision, the way Funke had mentioned, once carefully, that Rowan had such a good heart, the shape of an expectation that had been building for years, with no one person you could point to who had built it. He's never been unkind to me, she said. That's the thing that made it hard to name. He wasn't cruel, he was just constant, present in a way that was an encroachment I couldn't point to without sounding ungrateful for the loan my father needed. She looked at the cup. And I didn't want my parents to feel like I was undoing something they'd spent 6 years building without knowing what they were building. She had been holding it at arm's length for 2 years, staying busy, staying unavailable, making herself too occupied and too far ahead to be an easy conversation. She had told herself that as long as nothing was said explicitly, nothing had to be resolved, that the arrangement would simply remain a shape nobody named, and she could live around it without having to dismantle it. The cost of that strategy was that she couldn't fully open anything either. Couldn't let anyone in far enough to matter, because anyone who mattered would eventually ask about the shape she was living around, and then she'd have to name it, and naming it meant deciding something she wasn't ready to force her parents to bear. So she had stayed in the careful middle, warm but not open, present but not available, and she had gotten so good at it that she'd almost convinced herself it was simply who she was. I stopped knowing, she said, whether I was being careful because I was genuinely cautious, or because I'd been careful for so long that it had become the whole of me. She paused. And then you were there. And you were annoyingly, inconveniently, exactly the kind of person I didn't have a protocol for. Because you didn't push. You just stayed adjacent. And the adjacency kept being comfortable, and then one day it was necessary, and I didn't know when one became the other. In September, he had said things explicitly. He had told Emmanuel he wanted to formalize things, his word. He wasn't asking for permission, he was informing, because he had already decided, and because he had quietly assumed Emmanuel's agreement was part of the return on an investment made 6 years ago. He can call in the loan, she said. If he decides to, there's a clause that requires full repayment within 90 days. My father's business cannot absorb that. 30 years of work, and he couldn't absorb it. She paused. Rowan hasn't threatened to use it. He doesn't need to threaten. He just needs my father to know the clause exists. That's enough. And Sunday, I said. You brought me on Sunday, partly because I needed my parents to already know you existed before he made Saturday feel inevitable, she said. She held my gaze. I needed them to have a face and a conversation, and a Sunday afternoon before he arrived to tell them what the plan was. She was quiet for a moment. That's the part I planned. And the other part, she looked at the table. The other part is that I have wanted to introduce you to my parents since August, since the night we met. And I was afraid to, because letting someone matter to me is the part that costs. and I didn't know yet if you were someone who would stay when the cost became visible." She paused. "You matter to me. I should have said that first." "What's Saturday?" I said. "He wants to have dinner with my family. He told my father it would be a good time to discuss next steps." She said it the way you say something that has a specific gravity attached to it. Next steps. I asked her to send me the loan documentation. She sent it that evening. A scanned copy of the original agreement, 3 pages. I read it twice. I called a solicitor friend, not to ask her to act on anything, just to understand the terrain. She called back within the hour. "The callable clause is aggressive," she said, "but there's a refinancing provision on page 3 that whoever structured this did not highlight. It allows the borrower to replace the outstanding obligation with any qualifying institutional instrument and discharge the private arrangement entirely. Rowan would have no legal grounds to object if Emmanuel refinanced through a bank. Has he tried? I'd guess he didn't know to. How long would it take to get a preliminary offer? For a business with 30 years of clean operations, a few days for a preliminary, a week or 2 for a formal instrument. Saturday was 5 days away. Then, at 11 p.m., Nadia texted, "He moved it." Wednesday, told my father it would be better to meet before the weekend so they could plan properly. Wednesday evening. Wednesday was 2 days away. I read the text. I sat with it for a moment. Wednesday, 2 days. I thought about Rowan walking into that coffee shop with the calm of someone who had never once had to sprint for anything, who moved his chess pieces not because he was rushed but because he had decided the board was already his. Moving the dinner was not panic, it was efficiency. He'd seen the Sunday introduction. He'd assessed the threat. He was accelerating before we could. I read the loan document again. All 3 pages, this time starting at page 3. I looked up a contact at a commercial bank, someone I'd done a favor for, 18 months ago, straightforward, the kind of thing that doesn't accumulate interest unless you want it to. I texted Nadia, "Does your father know about the refinancing provision on page 3? 3 minutes. No. Then we need 2 days. Can you get me the business financials?" Another pause. Longer. Why? Because the clause he's been using as leverage only works if your father has no alternative. We're going to find him an alternative. The reply took long enough that I wondered if she'd set the phone down. Then, "You're doing this. If you want me to, I want you to stay," she wrote. "I asked you if you were the kind of person who stays. This is what that actually means." I called the contact at the commercial bank the following morning and asked for an expedited preliminary assessment. I wasn't asking for preferential treatment, just speed. I sent everything: 30 years of operating history, clean accounts, 0 defaults, asset valuations, client roster. The preliminary came back in 20 hours, favorable. The business was a strong candidate for a standard commercial loan that would cover the outstanding private obligation and allow Emmanuel to close it entirely. That evening, Nadia and I sat across from her father in the same sitting room where I had first shaken his hand. Nadia laid it out. Not emotionally. I had expected emotion and there wasn't any. Or rather, there was emotion underneath that she was using as fuel rather than display. She laid it out the way she laid everything out. In sequence, with the evidence, with the conclusion at the end rather than the front. The loan clause. What Rowan had said to Emmanuel in September. What formalize meant when a man who controls a callable debt says it to the man who owes it. What the Wednesday dinner had been designed to accomplish before she and I could accomplish anything first. Emmanuel listened with his hands flat on the arms of the chair and did not say a word. Not when she explained the loan clause, not when she described the September conversation, not when she said, plainly, that the man in the photograph on his mantelpiece had been using a financial obligation as a quiet, persistent pressure on his daughter's life. He listened with the complete stillness of someone who is deciding something fundamental and understands that anything he says before the decision is made will interfere with the deciding. When she finished, the room held the silence for a long moment. "You should have told me," he said, quietly. "Not to me, to Nadia." "I know," she said. "Why didn't you?" "Because I didn't want you to feel responsible for something you didn't know you were building." She met his eyes directly, the full, patient attention I'd first seen her use 2 months ago in a restaurant arguing about a film. "You trusted him because he gave you reasons to trust him. He made himself useful because being useful was the foundation. That's not your fault. You were building a business. He was building leverage. She paused. I didn't want you to look at 30 years of what you built and think it had become someone else's instrument. It hadn't. Not fully. Because we still have time. Emmanuel was quiet. He looked at his hands. He looked at the mantelpiece, at the frame, face down now on the side table. And you, he said, looking at me, you found an alternative in 2 days. The provision was already in the document he had your signature on, I said. Someone just needed to read all 3 pages. A sound came from Emmanuel that wasn't quite a laugh, more like a recognition of the kind of small, quiet audacity required to hide a protection clause in a document you're presenting as a favor. He looked at the mantelpiece, at the frame. He stood up, took the photograph off the mantelpiece, and set it face down on the side table. Not dramatically, practically, as if removing something from sight that had been misrepresenting what it was. He sat back down. He picked up the preliminary assessment and read it from the top line to the bottom figure. He set it down. This is a real offer, he said. Preliminary. Formal within a week if you proceed. He looked at his daughter, then he said simply, cancel Wednesday. She took out her phone. She wrote 2 sentences to Rowan. I didn't see them, but I saw what her face looked like when she sent them. Settled. Like someone who has put something down that they've been carrying for too long. When Rowan replied, within minutes, he had been watching his phone, she turned the screen toward her father without a word. I didn't see what the message said, but I saw Emmanuel read it, and I saw his jaw do the thing that jaws do when a man decides he has been patient with something for longer than it deserved. He picked up his own phone and made a call. The call lasted 5 minutes. Emmanuel's voice was completely level throughout, composed the way a building is composed, not because it's delicate, but because it's load-bearing and knows it. When he hung up, he said, Rowan will not be coming on Wednesday, or at any point after. He looked at me. You have a handshake, he said slowly, like someone who does not intend to move. No, sir, I said, I don't. He extended his hand. I shook it. The message in it this time was different from the first Sunday. That one said, I'm watching. This one said, I see you. The loan was refinanced within 3 weeks. 30 years of Emmanuel's business, consolidated into a standard commercial instrument, clean and fully independent. Rowan had no clause left to hold, no leverage left to exercise, and no reason the family was obligated to continue providing. The photograph did not return to the mantelpiece. Funke, in the kitchen later that evening, pressed a container of leftover jollof rice into my hands without asking if I wanted it. I understood that this was its own kind of statement. I took it home and ate it at midnight in my kitchen and thought about the specific texture of the afternoon, and about the photograph that was no longer on the mantelpiece, and about the fact that Nadia had texted at 11 p.m., simply, he's not coming. My dad called him himself. I had sent back, good. She had sent back, thank you. 2 words that held about 4 months of weight. What I learned later, through several conversations with Nadia over the weeks that followed, the slow-release kind of conversation that only happens when the pressure has been removed and there's finally room to be truthful, was that the full picture was more painful than the strategic version I'd first understood. Rowan had not been entirely calculating from the start. He had, in his own way, genuinely wanted her. The problem was that his version of wanting someone was the version where you acquire the family first, build the obligation, secure the circumstances, and allow the person to follow as a natural consequence of everything else having been arranged. He had never asked Nadia what she wanted because it had genuinely not occurred to him that her answer existed independently of the architecture he'd built around it. He was not a villain in his own story. He was simply a person who had never been required to understand that other people's lives were not materials. That was what she had been living inside for 2 years. Not cruelty. The steady, patient pressure of an assumption. The constant presence of someone who had decided she was already accounted for. I told you I wasn't ready for anything, she said to me one evening in November. We were in her flat, properly. Lights on, coats off, no careful distance between us. The city doing its thing outside the window while we were, for the first time, genuinely still. You did, I said. I meant it. She looked at me. I wasn't performing. I had been inside something for 2 years that made me not trust my own reading of what I felt. I didn't know if what I felt when I was with you was real, or if I was just reaching for the nearest person who seemed safe. She paused. And then I decided the only way to know was to let it be real and see what happened. What happened? You stayed, she said. When I finally told you what it cost to be near me, you didn't calculate the cost and leave. You read a 3-page document and called in a favor, and sat across from my father and didn't move. She shook her head slightly. That's how I knew. Knew what? I was ready, she said. I was ready the whole time. I was just afraid that the person I was ready for would leave when he understood what ready actually looked like. End quote. I thought about the Thursday in October, the table for two near the window, the way she'd said it, not as a door closing, but as a door she was still holding open, checking to see what I'd do with the information. I had thought at the time that she was telling me we were at an end before we'd properly begun. I understood now that she was doing the opposite. She was telling me the real terms, the honest terms, before she let herself care about the answer. She was giving me the exit before she'd let herself need me to stay. The thing about the not ready, I understood it now, was that it was never about not wanting something. It was about knowing exactly what you wanted and having been inside something that made you distrust your own wanting. It was about having had your own judgment used against you for long enough that you'd developed a careful, reasonable, entirely understandable habit of checking and rechecking before you moved. She had checked me for 2 months. She had moved. You were testing me, I said. No, she said. I was telling you the truth and hoping you were the kind of person who could hold it without needing it to be simpler than it was. I had held it. She had let me. I thought about Emmanuel, in that sitting room, turning the preliminary bank assessment over in his hands and reading it from top to bottom before he looked up. About Funke, who had watched the whole afternoon from the kitchen and the armchair and the corner of conversations, and who had pressed food into my hands at the door as if she'd already decided I was coming back before anyone else had said so out loud. About the photograph, face down on the side table, and I thought about a Thursday in October, and a door she'd been holding open, and me standing in front of it long enough to understand that the holding was itself the invitation. Have you ever told someone you weren't ready, and meant every word of it, and then done something that proved the opposite, not because you'd changed your mind, but because they had already changed something in you without asking permission? And have you ever had someone show up for you in the middle of something you were trying to handle alone, not because you asked, not because they knew the full picture, but because they simply decided you were worth the showing up, and realized that this specific and unbidden thing was what you had needed long before you knew to call it that? Leave your answer below. Someone will read what you write and feel less alone for it. Subscribe, and don't miss what comes next.